Hello everybody, welcome to another series setting breakdown. I am Paul Westman on Twitch at thewestman613. This is where I discuss some of my favorite series that you've probably never heard of because most of them tend to be on more indie publishing or self-publishing. So this is my way of trying to encourage other people to find interesting book series and to discuss them and hopefully become more interested in these. Today, I'm going to be discussing a series in urban fantasy called The Magician's Brother. This is an urban fantasy that's has one of the best hard magic systems that I've seen in any literature. It is an excellent format for how a hard magic system should be done, and it is a perfect example of what you can do with it. So, let's start. Like I said, this is first book in the series known as The Magician's Brother. Series that is authored by H.D.A. Roberts. And, alright. Let's go into the series itself, just some of the basics of it. First, like I said, it is urban fantasy. So, what that means is basically it deals with magic and various supernatural little phenomenon and supernatural races and creatures, but it is set in a modern times in modern cities. So, alright, as for series length, currently the series has 8 books out. The story arc, according to the author's notes, has been completed. It is specifically referred to as the Descent arc, and in that author's notes, he also said that there are more books that are coming with these characters, so I haven't seen any further updates on that, but these first 8 books do cover a comprehensive story arc to its completion. So, next, as for where it's located, it is located in England. And for people who are American readers, that's actually important to note because oftentimes there's spelling differences or cultural differences, especially in like school settings and whatnot, that are just off-putting to some American audience members. So you have to understand ahead of time this is a British book. It is set, like I said, in the modern era. No specific time frame is given, but there are references to like the World War, so it is set in our sort of historical. It's not its own entity, but like I said, it is set into the modern era. There are cell phones and all that. So, but there are some variances that in recent history that they refer to, and I'll get more into those later. Right now, time to talk about the magic system. This is really the main thing I want to talk about in this entire series because, like I said, it is a hard magic system, and just as a brief reference, so those who don't really know what the difference between a hard and soft magic system, a hard magic system is one that is set by specific rules. You do X, you get Y every single time. Whereas a soft magic system is more ephemeral. You don't really have any sort of limitations. A good example of a soft magic system would be any sort of magic that is used in like the Lord of the Rings. You don't know what its limitations are. It's not really defined. It's just magic and it happens. Now, for this series, magic is much more strictly defined. In fact, in later books, it is often referenced as a Newtonian magic system because of how strictly it adheres to certain rules. But first, we'll get into some of the more stricter classifications of how this magic system works. First, it's set up into a high magic and low magic. The high magic has 5 different specialties or affinities. First is time, then we have space, we have life, death, and shadow magic. These are all considered high magic. Any magic like dealing with time, with space deals with like teleportation. It can also affect like gravity. Life and death are pretty self-explanatory, and then shadow is also fairly self-explanatory as well. Next, we have the low magic. This involves some of the more common, what we would consider magic types. We have our basic elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and then we have some other rather common things where we have mind, flesh, and spirit. Then the last we have for the low magic is light. Alright. We have the descriptions of like where each type of magic kind of fall into on the categorization of the magic system here. There are other things that don't quite fit in. First we have black magic. Black magic is kind of a corruption of magic. It is often seen as a very corruptive system, and it will often warp and change any sort of magic, and it is considered illegal in this world to practice or even some cases learn about it, just because of how vile it is and how destructive it can be. Now, black magic tends to gravitate towards people who use shadow magic, but it is not exclusively to them, and oftentimes there's other magicians who can access that black magic as well. Next, we have the Fey magic. Fey magic is much more of a soft magic that's kind of introduced alongside of the Newtonian magic that I mentioned earlier. That is much more of not limited by the rules. So it is often spoken about as like more wild magic, and it is not seen as more or less powerful, but it is seen as more uncouth to the human magicians, and it is typically only accessible by the Fae. Next we have willpower. Basically, what that is it's not necessarily combining your magical essence into some sort of framework of spell, or adjusting it to fit into your specialty or affinities. Will is just using the raw magic force itself. It is considered very powerful, but considering that it is not in any sort of framework, it can also be more fragile, and because it's linked directly to the person using it, that also makes it more of a direct conduit to hurt someone, more than, say, like if someone puts up, once you break through that force of will that they put forward, you are directly attacking the person rather than breaking through the magic and having further layers beyond that you could use. So while will is considered a powerful magical force that you can use because of its direct connection, it is also a weakness to rely on it. Last thing is the dispels that are used. Oftentimes, dispels are specifically formed to counteract whatever magic is being sent at them. I list it as its own category, even though it is not specifically mentioned as its own category, because it is said to be very hard to use, but it is also, uh, since it can counteract any of the other magic types, it's not really, it can't really be categorized under them either. So, next up, we'll talk a little bit about affinity and specialty. Every magician has their own specialty. It's in one of the 13 main high or low magic categories that I described. Basically, what that means is anytime a wizard tries to cast a spell that through that type of magic, it is much easier for them than it would be to use a different type of magic. So basically, a light wizard can cast light spells more easily than they can cast wind spells. It's rather simple about that. And some specialties can also prevent you from even using like the opposing specialty at all. So affinity, however, is a little bit different. With an affinity, it's affinities are only at the highest ranked magicians, and what they do is, instead of being easier to cast the spell through that specialty, it becomes more like second nature, and you have to actually hold back if you want to cast any spells through that sort of type of magic. So an affinity is more like an extension of the arm rather than using a gripper. Next, we'll have enchanted items. That's basically items that are they are enchanted typically by sorcerers, who are one of the highest tiers of magicians, and what they are is basically imbuing magic into an item for a specific purpose. It's your typical enchanted items. The books don't really delve more into enchantment and the intricacies of it until later in the series, so we're not going to discuss it too much. But it's important to know at the start that some enchanted items are used regularly by certain types of people. Now we're going to get into how the power levels are described. Because like I said, it's a hard magic system. There are definitive levels that you can deal with. There's different names for how magicians are ranked according to their power. The lowest rank is considered an adept. Next we have your acolytes, then wizards, then sorcerers. And then above all of them are the archons, and we'll get into that later, because that's not necessarily a power level per se, but rather a position. Alright, now we'll talk a little bit about some of the various creatures that inhabit the world, and basically what makes this an urban fantasy. You have your magicians, that is the general name given to all the human magic users, basically. Next you have Fae. Again, in this world, Fae come from fairy, which is basically like alternate world per se of Earth. There's typical, just a different world that sort of occupies a similar area, and there's different Fae beings that on fairy versus Earth. And fairy is typically considered a far more magical place. In this series are also vampires, wares, basically your shifters. You have gargoyles, succubi, the H.D.A, which I've never really seen in other series, but those are examples of magicians who are overwhelmed by the black magic use, and basically the black magic overwhelms them, and what happens is they become extremely hard to kill and very powerful, but they lose a lot of their higher reasoning. So they're very uncommon in the world, but they are important, especially at the beginning. There's also ghouls brought up, and there's also an entire spirit realm, but that's not something that's really dealt with till much later. Next, we're going to talk about some of the politics of the world. Alright, first, there's the human government. We're not going to deal with that too much, because the human government kind of just gets passed over a lot later in the series because it becomes largely irrelevant. But early in the series, they do talk about like what's referred to as the supernormal police force, which is basically just humans that have been trained with some enchanted items that have that grant them some sort of protection against magic. And in schools in particular, they have magical supervisors, which are commonly referred to as Leopolds. The nickname for that, according to the books, is actually a reference to The Simpsons, where early on they had like a strict character named Leopold in the schools. Next we have the Conclave. The Conclave is basically the ruling government body of the supernatural, well, specifically of the magicians. It consists of several parts. There is a High Council, and then we have the Supernatural Crime Authority, the S.C.A. That's referred to as basically like the FBI or the law enforcement of the magical world. One thing to note about them is that they are considered very proactive in their approach to any sort of magical crimes, and they are considered very feared because oftentimes it is easier for them to just eliminate a problem rather than to apprehend someone or to actually seek justice in a situation. One thing that is brought up and is noted as a point of contention between the supernatural and non-supernatural world is that the Conclave is independent of the government, and so it does not actually answer to the human government. Then we have the Archons. The Archons are the 5 most powerful sorcerers in the world. They each represent and are considered an embodiment of their magical affinity. It is only an affinity to high magic that allows them to become Archons. And like I said, it's each one, and when one of the Archons die, what happens is instead of like them electing or looking for a new Archon, they are reincarnated into their next life. Now let's go over some of the relevant history. First is the withdrawal of the Archons, because in the book, roughly 20 years prior to the present, what happened was one of the Archons was a traitor. He betrayed the others, and that forced the other four to kill him. And what happened is, because the Archons are a very close-knit and very family-like group, that caused them to have a lot of issues and caused them to retreat and become far more solitary, and basically they took a step back from any sort of government or any sort of ruling that they might have. So what that did is that led to the Conclave basically taking over the entirety of the supernatural world, and that directly led to the Great Revelation. Now what that is, as you might be able to figure out, is when the Conclave decided that technology, and it was basically getting too costly to remain hidden from human world. So about 15 years ago, they decided they would reveal themselves and provide explanations as to what the supernatural world was and what was going on. Now, a lot is not mentioned about the Great Revelation. However, one thing that is brought up is that it caused some issues, and one of the ways that the Conclave decided to sort of resolve any sort of conflict with the human world was to initiate basically sports. They started televising dueling and making it a professional sport where two wizards or two magicians would battle each other with magic for the entertainment of the people. Which, let's face it, is a pretty good idea to get people on your side. Make it entertainment. Make it worthwhile with betting. Yeah, there are some rules, because dueling, while it became a form of entertainment for to help kind of rehabilitate and ingratiate magicians to humanity, it has been around for much longer and was considered one of the regular ways for magicians to resolve issues. Now, some of the rules are no high magic is allowed in dueling, because kind of basically high magic is far deadlier than most other types of magic. So by eliminating high magic, it helps to balance the field a little bit, and also provides the duelist safety, so that it's easier to survive. It's a best of 5 competitions. Basically, first person to strike the other person with magic, it gets points, and once you hit your opponent 3 times, match is over. Often what is used, especially in like the professional rings and in school, is there's an enchanted ring in the gymnasium or in the area that is used to sort of contain any of the spells, so that way they don't fly off and hit the spectators. Now, what happens is both combatants, they'll wear a leather vambrace, which is basically a bracer around their arm, and what that does is that absorbs any of the damage that would have affected the magician, and it's what also tallies the points. So basically, if the vambrace absorbs magic, that's considered a hit, and then that would be what calculates the points. Now, like I said before, there's a lot of different power levels for magicians, and so to keep things fair, what happens is if, say, a wizard, which was the third level, was battling against an acolyte, which was the second level, what happens is the acolyte would get more points for every time they hit than the wizard would. It's still best of 3, so an acolyte can basically gain more points for their team if they're acting as a member of a team than a wizard can, because the wizard's power levels is so much greater, which also allows them a greater diversity in how they can attack and how long they can sustain attacks. Alright, now let's talk, since we discussed a lot of the background, we'll get more into what the actual book is. Start with the setting of the book. One thing that's important to note, this is a book where the first 3 books of the series do take place in a high school environment. And I cannot emphasize this enough, this is not a young adult series. There's a lot of adult themes, adult situations. There's no graphic sex involved or described in the book, but there's a lot of gore and violence and death, and there are some adult themes. So not a young adult series, despite the fact that it starts off in basically a high school setting. But like I also said, this is England. Their schooling systems is slightly different than ours. So not exactly high school as an American would understand it. It's more closer to how the Harry Potter set up their school systems with the 7 or 8 year setup. Alright. Now, Windward Academy, which is where the main character is currently attending school, is set near a town, it's called Stonebridge, set in England. I'm pretty sure it's a fictionalized town, so it's not entirely based upon a real setting, but it gives you a good idea roughly where it is and kind of the town going on. It is mentioned that in the books, Stonebridge is one of the most magical towns in all of England. So supernatural creatures are not uncommon, but they're still rare enough that they're still a minority. Right, now we'll talk about the main character of the book, of the entire series, Matthew Graves. He is a wizard / sorcerer with a shadow affinity. Now, it does start off that he is not entirely used to working with shadows, because what happened was, as a child, when he first developed this affinity, basically he was very young and shadows started encroaching upon him. He naturally assumed that they were trying to attack him, and as a result he basically became afraid of the dark. So because of that, he hid his affinity and was able to even hide that he was a wizard or a magician for a very long time. And even at this setting in the book, he hasn't told anybody that he's a magician. Alright, basic description, he's rather small, he's got dark hair. It's mentioned that he has a heterochromia, which is basically 2 different colored eyes. He's got 1 blue and 1 green. And he is also smaller because when he was younger, he basically, not necessarily knowing exactly what he was doing, he needed to save his brother's life, and he did that by giving his brother some of his life force, which did stunt his growth a bit and also made him had longer lasting repercussions on his development. at least his physical development. We'll now talk about some of the more prominent characters in the series. I don't have them listed as main characters because our point of view basically always stays with Matthew, and but a lot of these are recurring characters. But it's most of them do drop off as the series goes on because it's a school setting at first, and it does extend well past the actual school. Another thing that should be mentioned is that at the start of the book, Matthew Graves is 17 years old. Now, most prominent characters would be Desmond Graves. Desmond Graves is Matthew Graves' twin brother. He is a magician himself. He is considered a high-level wizard, almost to the level of sorcerer, and his specialty is light magic, which is one of the rare specialties to have, especially at that level of power. One thing that is a big difference between Matthew and Desmond is Desmond really likes to show off his magic, and he's very his goal is basically to become a professional duelist. So he enjoys the fighting with magic, but it is stated that he's not the best with it. While he's a very powerful magician, he's not the most creative, and he has issues with studying. He's more brawn than brains, basically. Next up to mention are Kathy and Bill. Didn't necessarily get their last names in the first book, but they are Matthew's friends, his best friends in school. They're the ones he's always hanging out with, and they're both human, so they have no magic, but they're his closest confidants, even though he still doesn't necessarily tell them that he is a magician in and of itself. So next we have Belle. Belle is another magician in the school. She is, at the start of the series, Desmond Graves' girlfriend, and she is a water affinity magician who also enjoys the dueling. She does gain some prominence in the early books, but does drop off later in the series. Next we have Tathis Smith. She is a succubus, and she is one of the main reasons why I say this is definitely not a young adult book. That is because she is a succubus that does succubus things. Matthew first meets her when he is directed to her place of business, which happens to be a strip club. So eventually she later becomes far more friendly and magnanimous towards him, but she always remains exactly who she is. Alright, last two main characters to talk about are Agents Crab and Knowles. They are two agents of the S.C.A. who are brought in to help solve a mystery of sorts at Windward Academy, and basically from that I guess we can get into sort of the basic plot from the first third of the book or so. Yeah, basically what happens is in the plot, Matthew is demonstrated to be kind of like a small, more nerdy type character who is hiding any sort of magic. So what happens is he finds out that his brother, Desmond, he went out to a party that he wasn't supposed to go to because he had promised to do his homework. Matthew wasn't really happy with that, so he went out to confront him. But at the party, he encountered what I mentioned before with the H.D.A. And the H.D.A. is very attracted to light magicians and seeks to always destroy them because, like I said, their basis is generally from a shadow magician. When the H.D.A. went to attack Desmond, Matthew intervened. He pulled magic together and was able to destroy it. But then he wasn't noticed doing so at first, and he managed to get away relatively undetected. But since like I said, the H.D.A. are so difficult to destroy, there was a lot of investigation into doing not only who sent the H.D.A. or where it came from, but also who saved Desmond. And this leads to some typical shenanigans of Matthew trying to basically avoid getting caught. And after he avoids the basic investigation of what's going on, or who's trying to, or who keeps helping Desmond, I should say, he then moves on and starts to investigate where the H.D.A. came from himself. From there, his investigation leads in part to Tethys, who tries to basically capture him and sell him off at an auction to someone whose goal would be to corrupt Shadow Affinity magicians. But Matthew was able to rather easily thwart that plan, and basically the entirety of the book is him searching and eventually finding where the H.D.A. came from and putting a stop to what's going on. It's basically spoiler free for book one. The rest of the books, they do delve into a lot further. If you read the title of the books, it does give you some kind of rough spoilers that can rather be easily figured out just by reading the books. Wasn't that hard to see, but it's still a fantastic series. I go back and I reread parts of almost all the books relatively often, and like I said, it's one of the best examples that you can give of a hard magic system. And that's pretty much my series setting breakdown of The Magician's Brother.